Are you the one generating all the returns? Are you the one that's putting this whole thing together? And are the returns generated by your efforts? If it is, it's security. If it's not, you're good.
Hello and welcome to Pillars of Wealth Creation, where we talk about creating financial success with a special focus on business and real estate. I'm your host, Todd Dexheimer. Now, let's get to it. Hello and welcome back to Pillars of Wealth Creation. I'm your host, Todd Dexheimer. Excited to have Mauricio Rauld on the show. Mauricio, how are you doing today?
Good, man. Thanks for having me. I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, I look forward to having you on as well. Mauricio is the founder of Premier Law Group, the premier syndication attorney in the country that helps real estate syndicators stay out of jail. Kind of important, right? I don't think anybody wants to do this business to get put into jail. So, Mauricio regularly travels around the country speaking to real estate syndicators about the legal piece that fits into the syndication puzzle. I think something that's often forgot about it. Syndication, raising capital can seem like it's awesome. It's a great, and it is, but man, you got to make sure you're doing doing it right. So he shared the stage with Robert Kiyosaki, Ken McElroy, Brendan Turner, the real estate guys. So he's been around the block. Mauricio, give our listeners a bit more about your background, and now let's dive into the nuts and bolts, man.
Dude, I've been an attorney for 25 years and started my career at a law firm. I started litigation. So I'm like the guy that used to go to court, do the depots, do the motions, all that. I defended big securities firms, JP Morgan, American Express, whatever. Great firm, but I got tired. I found Rich Dad, Poor Dad, right? And that kind of changed my whole way of looking at things. So I left the firm, went in-house to become general counsel for the real estate guys and just did all of their syndication. That's kind of where I cut my teeth. And then what I ended up doing right after that is I started my own firm in 2006, Premier Law Group. And, you go through a bunch of ways. You got to put food on the table. You do pretty much anything you want. But over time, it's just gotten more and more narrow. The last two things I was doing was syndication, but also asset protection. So I'm kind of a recovering asset protection attorney, wrote a book that's behind me about it. But now we specialize in real estate syndication. So not only just syndications, but real estate syndications, and really honing on to these popular exemptions that people are using.
Are you focused on a specific niche in real estate? Is it mostly, multifamily is what I see because I'm a multifamily guy.
Yeah, as long as it's real estate, I don't care. So most of our clients are multifamily, probably 60 to 70%, but we do a lot of self-storage, a lot of mobile home parks, a lot of industrial, even single family homes. So as long as it's real estate related, we're good. If you want us to kind of raise money for like a crypto fund or a marijuana plant or something, then it's not going to be us.
Okay, cool. I want to ask you right off the bat, you talk a lot about staying out of jail, and then obviously in your intro, I mentioned that. What are things that you see people doing right now, commonly today, or maybe not commonly, but shouldn't be doing today, that you see over and over that's kind of bad, right? It's going to potentially be, a big fine or even jail time.
Yeah, it's probably I'll tell you what the real consequences are. I mean, I started using the jail thing probably about 4 or 5 years ago. I wrote a book, which I'm happy to share, called The 5 Things Every Syndicator Must Know to Stay Out of Jail. And jail's a little extreme, I must say, I'm not saying you can't go to jail, but I mean, unless you're, defrauding investors, Ponzi schemes, like Bernie Madoff stuff, absolutely you can go to jail. But the reason I use that word was very intentional, because a lot of people out there are really blowing off the securities law. They're like, oh, it's not a big deal, everybody's doing it, and they're just not following the rules. And I wanted to catch people's attention. But the real, if you do something non-compliantly, or, you violate some securities laws, most likely your penalty is going to be rescission, meaning you're going to have to return all the investors' money, plus interest, plus penalties. You're going to be barred from raising capital. And of course, you're not going to have the money because you've probably lost money in the deal. So you're going to file for bankruptcy and it's going to be a mess. So rescission is the main thing. Obviously, if you now get into fraud and everything, yes, jail comes into play. SEC can come knocking on your door for other stuff. But, probably the main one that I see, especially for first-time syndicators. So if you're out there, you're thinking about raising capital, or you just started, probably the biggest one is just not even realizing that you're actually selling securities in the first place. Like you're raising money from your buddies and it's like, oh, it's just a loan, or it's really the big one is, oh, I'll do this one as a joint venture. That's my favorite. Hey, I'm not really selling securities. I'm doing a joint venture because I don't know, it's a small deal or whatever. And whether it's a joint venture or syndication or a securities offering, the reality is you don't get to make that decision, right? It is what it is. Like the way you structured it, it's either a joint venture or syndication. So you can't just come on and say, hey, I'm going to do this one as a joint venture. So a security is anytime you take money from people where the returns are generated by your efforts, meaning you're doing all the work and the investor is essentially passive. And a joint venture would be where everybody's actively involved. Like there's only like 4 or 5 of you. We kind of max out at 5, and everybody's rolling up their sleeves and everybody's contributing to the return, because the minute one person isn't, now you have a security because the returns are being generated by one or more, or a group of people, usually called the syndicator or the sponsor. So,
but just you and your dad or your brother.
Yeah. So usually if you have 2 people, in that case, what I would do is I would set that up as a joint venture. Because first of all,
if your dad is passive, like your dad,
there is no my dad exemption, right? There is that's actually
I hear that all the time.
The friends and family exemption is the 506B, which we'll get to in a second, but that does require, it's an exception, but it does require a bunch of regulations. There is no, he's my dad or my brother. Yes, you could argue, well, what are the odds if it goes south that he's going to sue me? It's happened, but that's not going to be a defense, right? I will admit that I don't think the SEC or the state regulators are actively out there combing for violations. They just don't have the bandwidth to do that. So usually what happens is somebody complains, right? So then the question becomes, well, what are the odds of your dad complaining or your sister complaining? But if they do complain, or you just got unlucky and the SEC just stumbled across it, or a regulator stumbled across you, that's not going to be an excuse or an exemption. Oh, he's a family member. I was good. There's no such thing, right? And so what I would do there is I would structure that as a joint venture, where I would say, okay, well, let's create an LLC. Let me put me and my dad would be the co-managers of that LLC. So, because if you're a co-manager, by definition, you're active and you're making all the decisions. And that's how I would do it. But most people use joint ventures to raise capital. I think that's the mental mistake most people make, because that's not really a raising capital mechanism. Joint venture is you're starting a business. So if you want to get something bigger, maybe, let's say you have X amount of money, you want to buy a bigger, I always point to the one across the street because it looks like, I don't know, I think it's a hotel actually, or a motel or something, but it looks like it looks like a 50-unit apartment building. And it's like, hey, maybe it's worth $3 million. I've only got $500K. So, hey, Todd, you've got a lot of experience in real estate. Why don't you come and put your $500K along mine? And we bring in Joey, and between the 3 of us, we raise enough money and we all qualify on the loan and we all go to work on this property. So I'm doing the day-to-day, whatever. And so that's how you would structure something like that. But other than that, if you are taking money from investors where the returns are generated by your efforts, you're selling a security. And so you either have to register that security or find an exemption, or it's illegal. Those are your three options. But that's probably the number one mistake for really new folks, right? The structure doesn't matter. And I would venture to say some of the older, more experienced ones also try and get cute with it, right? And they're like, oh, I'm going to structure this in a really unique way. It's going to be a promissory note, or I'm going to do it where they're not part of the entity. It's just a side contract, or they just try and get creative. And the SEC couldn't care less. Like the structure that you put together, they don't care. They're going to look straight through the structure, and they're just going to ask the qualifying question which is, are you the one generating all the returns? Are you the one that's putting this whole thing together? And are the returns generated by your efforts? If it is, it's security. If it's not, you're good.
Love it. I want to dive into the raising capital for other people. It's done a lot. It's been done a lot for many years. I know some people that have gotten into some heat with it. And I hear it all the time too from people like, oh, so-and-so does it. Like, they're naming a big syndicator. Oh, so-and-so, does this all the time. Like it has to be legal, right? How can you raise, let's talk about that. First I want to talk about the fund of funds. The fund of funds thing has really popped up. That's become really popular. What are you seeing people doing wrong with fund of funds? Because there's probably a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it. What are you seeing, the right way and the wrong way?
There's definitely a right way to do it. I mean, fund of funds has been around for a long time. It usually
Right.
is in the private equity world where people are buying, equities and buying businesses or whatever, but it's not uncommon. I mean, the example I like to give, everybody, most of your audience probably heard of Ray Dalio's, right? One of the biggest hedge fund guys, but if like, he's kind of semi-retired now, but if he was going to go raise money for a fund, he's probably going to raise $1 billion, right?
Yep.
And so the minimum investment is going to be $100 million. Like you don't have, even if you're high net worth, ultra high net worth, you don't have 100 million or you don't want to put in. So there's going to be another entity that's going to be bringing in the minimum investment of 100 million, and they're going to sub syndicate or do a fund of funds to their investors. Which, by the way, at that level, it's probably another company that's really raising because the minimum might be 10 million for that fund. So there's a cascade effect, but there's certainly nothing wrong with that. It's done all the time. The issue that I have with the current environment is that it is marketed as a way to sort of get around the broker dealer rules that you can basically raise money for other people. And it's marketed as something that's faster, cheaper, easier. There's a bunch of marketers out there that are doing that. The reality is it can be done, but it's definitely more complicated because you're no longer investing in real estate. You're investing in a company, right? You're investing in shares of a company, LP units. So now you're buying securities as opposed to real estate, which opens up a whole new realm of regulations. I've got to worry about the Investment Companies Act, the Investment Advisors Act, broker dealer laws, all these other regulations that I don't usually worry about if you're just buying an apartment building. But because I'm buying shares in a company, I'm buying securities, that whole regulatory world is in there.
Yeah, makes sense.
The big one really is this investment advisory piece, because the Investment Companies Act is easy to get around because this is where you hear, hey, as long as I have less than 100 investors, that 100 investor rule, you're good. I mean, you count as one, so technically it's 99, but as long as you keep it under 99 investors, assuming you're just one person, then that's an easy one.
In a specific deal or in all
Yeah,
the
in that
deals you raise?
particular fund, right?
Fund.
And that's another thing. Like the fund to funds model really is meant to be a fund model where you're raising money into a fund, and then you are using your expertise to go out and vet sponsors, vet deals, do all the underwriting, and make a decision like, hey, I'm looking at 4 or 5 deals, or however many come across your desk. And then every so often you make a decision. Yep, I like this one. Hey, I came across Todd's one. It's awesome. Let me write a $500,000 check to Todd's deal. Let me write a $100,000 check to Mauricio's deal. But I'm doing that research, and the investors don't know what you're buying because it's just a fund. But what a lot of people are doing in these kind of single deals where they're literally identifying a particular property and they're just raising money for that particular deal. And the underlying sponsor is kind of doing all the work for you. It's like they're providing you with a business plan. They're providing you with all the underwriting. And if you're not doing anything, if you're just again, structure doesn't matter. If you're just raising a bunch of money into an LLC, into your fund, and then turning around and writing a check to somebody else, you're basically just raising money for that person. Again, the structure doesn't matter. So in order to do it properly, you have to be adding value to your investors, right? Whether that's, you're underwriting the deal independently, not somebody spoon feeding you and you just reading a report. I mean, most of my guys that are doing it properly are getting on a plane. They're flying down to the property and they're doing a walkthrough of the property to make sure they're doing their due diligence on the property. Your investors don't have time to do that. So that's a huge value add. They're the ones that are getting into the relationships with the sponsors, and they're meeting them and they're vetting them and they're going down to their offices and they're checking them out, because it's a big responsibility. You're writing a check into one of their deals. It's not just a piece of property. It's also an operation. It's a business. So you've got to do all that work. And if you do that, then fine. You're probably not going to be considered sort of a broker dealer or somebody who's just there to raise money. You're actually adding value. But the big one that most people like to jump over and try to make really all the excuses I've seen in the world is this issue of the investment advisory thing. Because anytime you've got a fund and you're investing in securities, the way the SEC looks at you is that you're basically advising your fund as to the purchase of security. You are an investment advisor, right? And so then the question becomes, what does that mean? Do I need to do anything? Do I need to register somewhere, or am I exempt? And so I got to look at that whole regulatory framework. And unless you're doing more than $150 million in assets under management, that's a state by state issue. So some states are very accommodating and they don't care. Florida comes to mind. It's like if you're in Florida and you have a fund, and Florida state law is very forgiving. As long as you don't hold yourself out to be an investment advisor and you don't have a bazillion of these funds, you're good. But, California is a pain, as you can imagine. California is a lot stricter, right? And so they may limit you to accredited investors only, or even higher qualified clients. So you just have to look at your particular state. And what most people are doing is they're not doing that. They're ignoring that. They don't know about it, or they just decide that they don't want to do it because they come up with some some excuses to why that doesn't apply to them. And because if they did have to do the states, it would be super expensive to do because you got to do that. And that you might be limited. Like even Texas, which is a great state, Texas says, yeah, you can do that. You don't have to register as an investment advisor with us here in Texas, but we're going to limit you to accredited investors only, which isn't not the end of the world. And you've got to file a small, it's called an ADV form, a truncated ADV form with the state. Not a huge deal, but if you want to take non-accrediteds in your deal because you want to do a 506B. Yeah. So anyway, so there's just a lot. My point, I don't want to lose people in the details there, but my point is there's a lot more regulation that comes into play when you do a fund of funds. And it's generally a little bit more expensive and it's a little bit more cumbersome. It's a little bit more complicated. And if you follow the rules, no problem, right? If you're going to get on a plane and fly down and show to me that you did do some due diligence and some underwriting. We just literally had an enforcement action from the SEC. It came out, I think in May. I did a whole episode on my show that they basically nailed a guy who was just doing a fund of funds, right? Just raising money into his fund. He raised, I think, $2.7 million into his fund, turned around and invested in an underlying group of funds from the same sponsor. And he got nailed for not being a registered broker dealer. So that's an issue that you got to look for that. Like, why do you need to register as a broker dealer or is there an exemption? And there are exemptions, but you got to fit in them. And so anyway, there's just a lot more regulatory stuff. And I think people are just not, they don't want to go there because a lot of the fund of funds that I think that are having issues or that are potentially going to at some point down the road have issues is they're raising such a small amount of money because they are specifically raising for a specific deal. So they're raising 200 grand, 500 grand. The economics doesn't justify to go spend 15 or 20 grand to do compliance if it's done properly because it just the economics aren't there. And so they choose to ignore it or they don't know or they've been told those things. So anyway, but that is definitely a thing that I think is becoming a bigger and bigger issue because people have been shifting away from another model that was very popular several years ago, but that had its own set of issues, this co-GP model of raising capital.
Right.
And so because they realized, oh crap, that's not really kosher. Let's do this now, this fund to fund model. And my expectation is that that's going to suddenly go, oh crap, that's not the way I should be doing it. I'm just kind of curious to see what the next fad or the next thing that's going to be in the market to see what at
the next way to avoid it being in jail, right?
At the end of the day, you cannot raise money for other people unless you have a broker dealer's license, right? And that even applies for every single syndicator that's out there. So Todd, I mean, even you, unless you're just doing something by yourself, obviously if it's just you, then obviously you're raising money for your own account and yes, you created an LLC, but it's basically you, right? But everybody out there that's raising money with co-sponsors, like even if it's one other person, right? That's a legitimate partnership, no problem. The general rule is they would have to get a broker dealer license in order to go do the syndication. The reason they don't have to is because they fit neatly into an exemption. And most people we've never really talked about the exemption until now because now it's become an issue. But all of the sponsors, syndicators that are raising money have to go by the rules of they have to either register as a broker dealer or they have to find an exemption. 99.9% of them will rely on an exemption, which is called an issuer exemption, which makes sense if you're a syndicator. It doesn't make sense when you're just out there raising money for the for the GP team and that's all you're doing. You're not going to fit into that exemption. And so now you're just acting as an unlicensed broker.
Is there a way because the co-GP was happening for a long time, up until fairly recently, and it still happens, right? Don't get me wrong, but the fund of funds is kind of taken over on that model. Is there a way if you are a co-GP and you're consistently raising for, 1, 2, 3 sponsors, whatever it might be, that it makes sense to co-GP, or would you say, hey, probably doesn't?
As long as you fall into the exemption, sure. So you have to fall into the exemption. So there's a lot of them.
Yeah. What's an example?
There's basically, I think there's about 6 or 7, but the 3 main ones that really apply, for us is number 1, you do not get paid transaction-based compensation. That's the big one. It's transaction-based, meaning I get paid if I raise money, or I get paid more if I raise more. And by paying doesn't mean cash. It could be literally shares. Hey, if you raise $1 million, I'll give you 5% of the GP. If you raise $2 million, I'll give you 10% of the GP. That's transaction-based, right? So if that's the hallmark of broker dealer. So if that's what's going on, you're done. You're dead in the water. Forget it. So number 1, you cannot take transaction-based compensation. Number 2, you must be substantially involved in the syndication. You have to have what's called quote unquote substantial duties, right? And so as a syndicator, cool. I'm doing the research, the market, I'm doing underwriting, I'm doing due diligence. Once we close, I'm doing asset management, I'm executing the plan, you're doing everything, right? So they're obviously doing substantial duties. So the question is this person that's coming in, who's bringing in capital, what are they doing? Are they doing something substantial after the deal closes? Not during the beginning, but once the offering closes, what are they doing? So that's number 2. And number 3 is their primary role, meaning they have to spend more than 50% of the time has to be on those duties and not raising capital, right? And so the first and the third one's pretty straightforward. Transaction-based compensation, I can tell you black and white. Primary just means how much time did you spend? How much time did you spend raising capital? I spent, X amount of hours, and how much time have you spent on the deal itself? I spent, and as long as it's more of the thing, you're good. The substantial duties is like, right, gets really nebulous, right? Like, what the hell does that mean? Like, is this enough? Is that enough? And that's where I think people are in that gray zone where they're trying to manufacture duties, and they're arguing, yeah, this is substantial, and we just don't know whether whatever they're saying. But you're gonna have to convince a regulator that those activities are substantial. If they disagree, then you're not gonna be allowed to use the exemption.
But if you've spent 75% of your time on the deal and the workings of the deal versus raising capital, probably have a good argument, right? If you spent 10% of your time on it,
and it's also
not a good argument.
And it's everything in the SEC world is very facts and circumstances intensive. So you threw out a fact pattern, which is interesting because people don't think about it. There's a difference between if you and I, Todd, start a company and it's called, the T&M equities, right? So we create T&M equities and we're together for 3 years and we go buy 4 or 5 or 6 deals together, right? As a company, right? That's one set of circumstances, right? Yep. The other set of circumstances, let's say we do 7 deals in the next 3 years together, right? That's our company. We did 7 deals. Cool. Yeah. The other option is I go do a deal with 7 different people in 7 different syndications over the next 3 years. That's a different set of circumstances. So that one, you're going to get a lot more scrutiny because you're hopping from one team to another. Are you really doing substantial duties? If I'm in the company and it's my company with you and me, or there's 4 of us that are part of a company, it's a lot easier to argue that you're not acting as a broker. This is my company, for crying out loud,
Yeah. Makes sense. On the back to the fund of funds, so when you see these companies, these groups raising a single deal on a single deal, you're saying that could be okay. That could, because I've always understood it. You should.
The question I would ask is, what are you doing? Yeah. Right. I think you have got to be doing even more, because now it's like, okay, you're not getting paid to select a deal because you've already found it. You're literally putting in your documents that, hey, the purpose of my raise is to give it to Todd.
Yeah.
Right. And so now you've got to really, I think your burden to show that you independently underwrote and did the due diligence and did some work is a lot higher. And so the question is, what did you do? Right. If you independently, did your research, again, most of my guys that do that kind of stuff will get on a plane. I mean, if you're going to go buy an apartment, if the underlying business is going to go buy an apartment building, what would you do if you were a sponsor? You'd go get on a plane, you would do a walkthrough. And that's what a lot of my clients will do, is they'll go down and they'll look for themselves. Yeah. Yep. And then, trust but verify. Yeah. You give me a bunch of documents for, here's what the projections are, but you're going to do some independent digging. You're going to ask for supporting documentation. You're going to do a deep dive into the underwriting. And again, a lot of them will fly down because usually my fund to fund guys, they want to establish relationships. They want to be able to go raise money and say, look, I've got these 3 people that I've vetted and I know them real well. So if you're going to vet folks, usually you're flying down and they either have offices and you're meeting their team, you're looking at their operations, you're talking to other investors. I mean, you're literally doing a due diligence, thorough work, because that's the value. That's what you have to be able to argue, that you're not there to just raise money for Todd. And I'm giving Todd as an example. And by the way, if you're the one that receiving the monies, I don't have that much issues. Like if you're the one that's accepting the money, like you don't have any, affirmative duty to go make sure that whoever's doing that over there is complying.
That was my question. So if I'm the syndicator and I've got, if I have somebody bringing in $1 million into my deal and it's a fund, do I have to verify that they actually did their due diligence and they're following the SEC rules and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, no, the only thing you need to worry about, and I have seen this happen too, is that the way, when done properly, when structured properly, the fund of funds manager gets paid through the fund. Right. So the fund's revenue is the distribution from the underlying syndication. Right. So what happens is that the distribution happens, the fund gets the revenue from that. And then from that revenue, you get your split you take your asset management fee and you split it. Right. So one of the things a good fund manager will negotiate better terms. Right. I'm bringing in all this capital. I don't want the regular 70-30 split. So I don't want 70% of it. I want 80%, or I want a better prep. So that's how you generate more revenue for the fund. What you absolutely don't want to be doing is making a direct payment Because if you start making a direct payment, so let's say I raise a bunch of money, give it to you, I can negotiate better terms, right? So, hey, Todd, you got to give me more money to my fund, right? I'm going to negotiate more revenue to my fund from where I can take my fees. If you then make a payment to me separate, like, hey, I know you brought in $1 million to my fund. Thank you. Here's a $50,000 check.
Here's an
Now
acquisition fee.
you are paying an unlicensed broker.
Yeah.
And my guess is you did not disclose in your PPM that you made a payment to an unlicensed broker. So now you've got a disclosure problem. That's the only time. But if you just have a fund and you treat that fund like your LP and you treat them like everybody else and per the docs, and you just give the distribution pursuant to the arrangement, you're going to be good.
So seeing groups that have courses out there that are teaching fund of funds, you know, how do you do it, and in the hopes that that fund person that will raise money and then bring it into their deal, does that cause any potential issues? Like, we taught them how to do it so they can bring money into the deal, and now they didn't do it right, and we knew.
I mean, I still think the main liability is going to be on the fund manager. The underlying person accepting the monies. Again, as long as there's not an indirect payment, right, and stuff, I don't think they have as much of an issue. I have seen a lot of folks trying to do almost making like turnkey, which makes it worse because it's turnkey for the fund manager. So it's like, okay, then what are you doing, fund manager? Like, if you're not doing anything, it's turnkey, then it looks like you're just raising money for them, right? So it's like you want the opposite. You want to be able to show an investigator or regulator, hey, I did this. But if it was just handed to you as a turnkey, no matter who gives it to you, and then that's different. But I think the underlying person, I think, again, as long as you're giving the proper disclosures to everyone, and as long as you're not paying anybody, you know, a broker's fee for an unlicensed broker fee, as long as you're not paying somebody to come raise money for you, I think teaching that is just, it's kind of in your enlightened self-interest. But I don't necessarily see a problem with that, other than again, it's almost like you might be, you know, if you ever have an issue with any of this stuff, by the way, what I would highly recommend doing, because I ask, when people call me and talk to me about this, the first thing I will tell them, and it's surprising how I never get this, is I say, look, who's your securities attorney, or who's your securities attorney, number one, because obviously not me. So who is your securities attorney? Get that in writing, like whatever they're arguing, get that in writing, have them cite whatever statute or whatever law that they're relying on, send it to me. And I'm happy to have a conversation with this attorney, or I'm happy to have the discussion once I understand what position he's taking or she's taking. But that never happens. Nobody ever emails me an introduction to attorney, or here's the attorney's regular, you know, because who knows? I do have a little bit of an ego, but it's like, hey, if you show me some case law or some no action letter or some document from the SEC, which I've got a bunch of them that I didn't know about, like for some reason I missed it, or it's brand new, or it's a new thing, you know, because things come out all the time. So maybe something came out last week that I don't know about, like this enforcement action that came out in May. A lot of people don't know about it, and it proves me wrong, or it sheds light in your favor. Then please send it to me. I want to learn. But I've seen the documents, I've done the research. I've seen all the information that's coming from the SEC. SEC puts out papers all the time. So they talk about what exactly is a fund manager and all that stuff. And until somebody can show me a case or something where a different position is taken, I'm just looking at the black and white rule. First, I'm looking at the law, and then I'm looking at SEC staff documents that are interpreting that and basically supporting, you know, what I believe is correct.
As somebody raising capital, there's deals right now going south, right? And any deal that goes south, there's always a potential lawsuit. Obviously, it's too late now for anybody that raised money on a deal. Hopefully, they did things the right way, and if their deal goes south, which hopefully it doesn't, hopefully they did things the right way. But for those looking at it going, okay, well, let's learn from our potential past mistakes. What any advice that you would give to somebody looking to raise money right now to make sure they don't get a lawsuit from their passive investors, or they, they're
there's a couple of angles to that. One of the things I also did a show on this, is the co-GPs are coming to realize that, hey, I don't have as much control over this deal as I thought, and I can't even get a hold of the main GP now, so I don't have any information. I've kind of got shut out myself, and so that's something to learn. Is like, hey, make sure that when you do become a co-GP, remember that you're getting into business with this group of people. So vet them. You're starting a business with them. Anything they do is going to affect you. So if you're abiding by the rules and one of your co-GPs decides they're going to go do all this illegal or non-compliant stuff, it's going to come on you. You may have not done anything wrong, but because they did, the whole deal goes south. You're going to get dragged down with you. And so that's something to keep in mind as a co-GP. But so that's kind of one of the big things I would think. The other thing I would highly recommend everybody, this is more for GPs. I spoke at the Best Ever conference, and this was a big theme for LPs. LPs were pissed, right? They're upset at general partners. Not so much. I think obviously they're upset because they're losing money and the distributions have stopped. So we get that. But many GPs have decided not to communicate with their investors, and they're basically sticking their head in the sand, which is, I think, exacerbating the problem. Ken McElroy talked to me this a long time ago that, when things aren't going well, that's the time for you to double, if not triple, your level of communication, because communication builds trust. And I think a lot of syndicators are losing the trust of investors, and those investors are going to come back in the next cycle, right? And so these sponsors are going to want to continue to raise money. I don't know if you know this stuff, but there are a ton of groups out there, whether they're Facebook groups or there's like a community of LPs that only have LPs. Word gets around. They know which sponsors are doing what, and they're not communicating. And so moving forward, when you're trying to raise capital, the investors are going to talk amongst themselves like, oh yeah, that guy, he never communicated with me. He didn't make distribution. So just be aware of that. I think things are going to go south. I mean, especially, interest rates went from 0 to 5 in in the span of 18 months. That crushed everyone.
Yep.
Rate caps expired. I mean, it's almost like the great financial crisis. I don't know if you necessarily have a cause of action that way. It's just like, did you really fall below the standard? I don't know. That's a separate issue. But when you bury your head in the sand, even if there's no lawsuit, even if there's no regulatory action, people are going to know, they're going to remember. It's going to be sort of a stain in your reputation. When you try and raise capital next year or the next cycle, I think that is going to hurt you. Not to mention that we have to now disclose many of these things in the future, right? If one of your properties is now in foreclosure, that's a disclosure. So it's going to make, harder to raise capital in the future. But I've got people who've done a masterful job of it. They've lost money, or maybe they haven't necessarily lost money, but their deals are in trouble. They stopped making distribution. They may even have done some cash calls, but their communication has been off the charts. And so investors, I think, just understand. It's like, hey, what is your investor going to say when you say, look, nobody anticipated interest rates going from, I bought this property at 4, I got a rate cap at 6.5. That rate cap is now expired, and now I'm going up to 9. And they've just been doing a nice job of communicating with the investors. Here's the plan. Here's what we're trying to do. And then I've seen one where it's like, hey, we've been updating them along the way. And now it's like, hey, here were the 7 options that we have. We decided this was our best option. This is the option we're going forward. And they're just laying it all out. And look, if at the end of the day, one of them is a cash call and they can't raise money and they end up losing money, people are going to lose money. That doesn't mean that, their reputation is going to necessarily be tarnished as much as if you just stick your head in the sand and not communicate.
Yeah, agreed. Double, triple up communication. Look, if you're doing quarterly updates, it's pretty easy. Just start doing monthly updates. Tell investors exactly what's going on. Don't hide the bad stuff. I mean, I can remember one of my properties when I purchased it, we had all kinds of issues, plumbing, breaks, and flooding from plumbing and all that kind of stuff. And I just communicated like constantly to investors. And I was sending monthly updates. I was sending twice a month. I'm sending updates. Here's what's going on. Here's what we're trying to do. And I don't know how many investors out of my group like really appreciated and told me like, look, you're over communicating. So it's so awesome. It's refreshing. I'm sorry we're going through this. Like, man, you're working hard. And yeah, I'm sure I know someone weren't excited because we weren't distributing capital we were supposed to be at that time. But, luckily we righted the ship and everything worked out. Everybody got good returns. So happy story, right? But at the same time, even if it didn't go that way, at least you're communicating with your investors consistently, and they're not in the dark. When somebody's in the dark, I mean, think about it. We've all been there. Like, we're not getting communicated with. We're just pissed. Like, and we're assuming the worst thing. And we're assuming that this, person that's not communicating with us is doing things behind our back. They're conniving. It's just like your mind starts to wander and you're like, oh, this is, and it's not good for anybody.
And do it early too. I mean, especially with the thing like the rate cap was such a big deal. It was like, hey, look, let them know, you know what? Our rate caps are expiring next year. You can give them a year ahead. Hey, they're expiring next year. This is what we're doing because obviously we're already exploring options, but just let you know it. And then, hey, they're expiring in 3 quarters. Hey, they're expiring in 6 months. I'm like, so by the time I expire, it's not like, oh crap, it's expired. Like you've just been telling them in your quarterly reports or monthly reports what's coming. And so they see it coming. And I think people can adjust accordingly.
Yeah, that's a great point. And so my business partner is an LP in a deal and they haven't done a capital call, but the sponsor sent out their quarterly update. And in that quarterly update, they mentioned that they've got rate caps expiring and that in 2025, expect a capital call. And so, I mean, we're sitting here recording in August of 2024. That came out, you know, that I think it was in July, and it said expect a capital call sometime in, and I think it even said in spring of 2025. And we're not sure on the amount. We'll give you more detailed information as we get closer.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Now I know what to expect. Now I'm not surprised by it when it comes and pissed off. So, what about an LP? Can the LP, do anything or?
Well, the LP can only do one thing, and that's their due diligence, right, on the front end, and not make assumptions that real estate always goes up and, hey, where everybody's getting 15, 20% return. This is guaranteed money. Like, I think, I think sponsors can probably do a better job. I mean, obviously the PPM is full of, you could lose all your money, all that stuff, but they just need to understand that. On the LP side, I'm sorry. I mean, I know I get a little bit of slack on this, but I mean, it's on the, I mean, if you're an LP, you've got to, you've got to take responsibility. I mean, you made the investment, you did your due diligence. And if you didn't do your due diligence, it is what it is. Now, if the sponsor lied to you or didn't
fraudulent
something, that's different, but you got all the disclosures. You knew exactly what you were getting into. You wrote a check, and it's not a piggy bank. It's not an ATM. It's like you're investing in a business, and the business sometimes does well. So I don't know. I think there's only so much the LP can do, and it all happens before you write the check. Once you write the check, there's not much for you to do. I've been overdue now. One of my favorite LP investors, Jeremy Rauld, you probably know. I had him on the show, I think earlier this year, and I'm about to release his episode, but he gives a lot of great, quick plug. It's Real Estate Syndicate Live, but I do these every week, and he came on, I think in March or something, and his episode's about to release, but you've got to do all the research. And that's what he goes through. It's like, hey, I look at the doc. These are certain things I look for in documents before I make the investment. And he's been sitting on the sidelines for the last couple of years because he just didn't like where things were going. So you just can't, if you're an LP, you just got to take full responsibility. This is not guaranteed money. You've got to do your due diligence on the sponsor. You got to make sure they can execute the plan. You've got to do all your things. And there's plenty of questions to ask out there. I think I've got my own somewhere, but there's a bunch of questions you should be asking and doing your due diligence on the sponsors.
Yeah, I just had Alexi. I can't even say his last name. Sure, but
I know.
Yeah, and he has a whole bunch of information on. What do you ask people? What do you ask GPs, and how do you do your own due diligence? I think that's super smart. And one of the biggest things he said is stop chasing the returns. Like if you see a 20% IRR, it doesn't mean it's better than a 12 or 14% IRR.
That's a concept that as an LP, you should know these things. You've got to get educated that there's something called a risk adjusted return. So yes, this return might be higher, but when you adjust it for whatever the risk is, that's what you should be comparing with. What you need to be so if this is a 20% return, but your odds of losing your money are 50-50, and the other one's at 15% return, actually the 15% is a better return because the risk of losing your money is less than the other one. But anyway, so I don't want to put a blame game. I just think everybody should I'm really big on personal responsibility. And I think if you're an LP and you're making an investment, you should be educated. And if you're not educated, then either find somebody to help you, a representative that can help you, or just don't invest. It's not guaranteed money. It's a business and you got to know it.
Yep. I've lost money in the stock market. I think everybody has.
Exactly. I've lost money on, and I never blame. I actually lost some money to a Ponzi scheme, and I mean, there was fraud involved, and I'm like, that was my fault. Like I didn't do my proper due diligence. I just trusted the person, and I just went with it, and I didn't do my due diligence, and that's on me.
Yeah. Man, this has been good. I got a ton more questions I can ask, but I want to respect your time. I got two last questions I ask everybody. What's a favorite book you can recommend to our listeners?
Man, there's so many, right? I, I mean, I could do the Rich Dad Poor Dad, which is probably one of my biggest things. There's a book called Traction. I know you said one. There's a book called Traction, which is great. Wickman, I highly recommend that. But the one that I'm recommending these days, actually from one of my coaches, it's Dan Martell's Buy Back Your Time. It's just an amazing, that's kind of one of those, it's in my Hall of Fame books now. It's one of my top, I'm up to 4 books that I have in my Hall of Fame. And that's one of them. So Buy Back Your Time by Dan Martell. He will change the way you think about everything from business and lifestyle and everything. It's an amazing leadership and somewhat of a time management tool.
Yeah, it's a great book and great author. All right, last question. What are your 3 pillars of wealth creation?
I think it's the same as the pillars for just success in general. So, I mean, I think the first pillar of wealth creation is just defining what that is. Like, what is your vision for wealth creation? Like, because if you don't know what it looks like, then it doesn't really matter. I mean, are you trying to make $100,000 a year? Are you even talking about finances, or are you talking about relationship? What does wealth really mean to you? So number one is defining the thing and having a clear vision on it. And so the second pillar would be coming up with a plan to go execute on that. If you're talking about money, it's definitely adding value. You've got to, I mean, money is just a representation of value. So if you want more wealth, money wealth, you just got to create more value. And then the other thing I would say on the money wealth is just, try and spend the least amount of money of your active income. If you can get your active spending to 50% or less of your active spending, of your active income, that's going to go a long way to that wealth creation process. And then the last thing I would say is just, it's really difficult to do that on your own. So you got to have a team and leverage that team, because Buy Back Your Time talks about that a lot. Like, there's only so many hours in the day, and you can do so much more, exponentially more, if you work on your leadership skills. You can work on getting the team together, because ultimately what you have to do, and Dan talks about this a lot in his book too, but it's not a Dan, it's I think more of a Jim Rohn thing. But it's like, the question I think I always like to ask myself is, once you figure out what wealth creation is, you come up with a plan, then the magic question is, who do you need to become in order to achieve that? What person do you need to become? What books do you need to read? What information, what skills do you need to develop? Because the only reason you don't have that now is because you don't have those skills. So figure out what you need to do and improve, and just become that person. And it may take 2 or 3 or 4 or 10 years, but just always strive to becoming that person that lives in that vision of wealth creation.
Yeah, so good, so good. Mauricio, look, man, I really appreciate this, and you broke this down pretty easy for people, but it's still heavy information. So if people want to learn more about, the world you live in, which has a lot of information in it, how can people get in touch with you? How can they learn more about what you got going on?
A good way to get in my world is, if you want a copy of the 5 things every syndicator must know to stay out of jail, where I go through the 4, just go to stayoutofjail.com and get your info there. You'll get that there. And if you want to know a little bit more about fund of funds, especially that new enforcement action that came out, just track me down on Instagram. Just message, follow me on Instagram, shoot me a message, just say fund of funds, and I'll send you that SEC case that came out in May, because I think that's super enlightening as well.
Love it. Again, Mauricio, man, really appreciate it. And you have a fantastic rest of the day.
You too, man. Appreciate you. Good show.
Hey, thanks so much for listening. I appreciate you being a loyal listener. I would love to have you go on to our Facebook page and subscribe, give us a thumbs up, go on to iTunes or wherever you listen and give us a rating and review. Don't forget to subscribe. Your rating and review just helps us push this out to more and more people and continue to grow our audience, and hopefully positively affect a ton of people out there that really need this and want this. So the other thing I've got for you is a free ebook on my website. So go on to venturedproperties.com, and download our free ebook on real estate and on syndication. And I've got some data points in there, some really good stuff for you. So I'd love to have you take a look at that. It's free. I'm not expecting anything from it. And also, look, if you want some help in multifamily, want some help learning, growing, getting your business off the ground, I would love to talk to you about what it would look like to work with me potentially and see if that's a good fit. So you can go to coachwithdex.com and check that out, and we can definitely have a call. Thanks a lot for listening. You make it a fantastic rest of the day. I'll catch you on the next episode.